The funeral director's hands were cold as ice when he placed the mahogany urn containing my husband's ashes into my trembling palms. 43 years of marriage reduced to 6 pounds of gray dust, and all I could think about were the words my son Danny had whispered in my ear just moments before. "Now we can finally get rid of you, Mom." The weight of that urn felt like nothing compared to the crushing realization that the family I had devoted my entire life to building was about to crumble around me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing there in Riverside Memorial Chapel, surrounded by flowers that would wilt by morning and sympathy cards that felt as hollow as my chest, I watched my son Danny shake hands with the last of the mourners. His wife Jessica stood beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on his arm, her smile as practiced as a politician's. They looked like the picture-perfect grieving family, but I knew better. I had heard what Danny said, felt the venom in his voice, seen the cold calculation in Jessica's eyes when she thought no one was looking. The irony wasn't lost on me that Robert's death had revealed more about my family's true feelings than 40 years of holidays, birthdays, and family dinners ever had. The man who had been my anchor, my protector, my reason for getting up every morning, was gone. And with him went any illusion I had harbored about my place in this family I had sacrificed everything to create. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was Robert's wife, Danny's mother, Emma and Lucas's grandmother. I was the woman who had given up her teaching career when Danny was born, because Robert believed a mother's place was in the home. I was the one who had spent decades organizing family gatherings, remembering birthdays, sending care packages to college, and being the emotional glue that held everyone together. I had met Robert at a church social when I was 22, fresh out of Northwestern University, with a degree in elementary education and dreams of making a difference in children's lives. He was 25, handsome in that clean-cut way that made mothers approve and fathers trust, working as an accountant for a small firm in downtown Chicago. Our courtship was traditional, predictable, and exactly what my parents had hoped for their only daughter. Robert proposed on Christmas Eve in my parents' living room, getting down on one knee in front of the tree while my mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and my father nodded his approval. The ring was modest but pretty, a small diamond, solitaire that caught the light from the colored bulbs strung across the mantel. I said yes because it felt like the natural next step, because Robert was kind and stable and wanted the same things I thought I wanted. We married the following June in a ceremony at First Methodist Church of Riverside, where I had been baptized and confirmed, where my parents had been married 30 years before. The reception was held in the church basement, decorated with white tablecloths and centerpieces my mother and I had crafted from silk flowers and baby's breath. It was lovely in that simple, wholesome way that defined everything about my early life. The first few years of marriage were content, if not passionate. Robert worked long hours during tax season, but he was home for dinner most nights, and we fell into a comfortable routine. We bought a small house on Maple Street, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a front porch where I imagined sitting with our children someday. I taught second grade at Lincoln Elementary while we saved money and talked about starting our family. When I became pregnant with Danny, Robert was over the moon. He had always wanted children, especially a son to carry on the Thompson name. I was excited too, though part of me mourned the career I was about to abandon. The principal at Lincoln had been grooming me for a vice principal position, praising my innovative teaching methods and natural leadership abilities. But Robert was firm in his belief that our child needed his mother at home, and I convinced myself that raising our son was the most important job I could have. Danny arrived on a snowy February morning after 18 hours of labor that left me exhausted but euphoric. He was perfect, with Robert's dark hair and my green eyes, 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a cry that could wake the dead. Robert was so proud he handed out cigars to every man in the waiting room, regardless of whether he knew them. I had never seen him so happy, and his joy was infectious. Those early years of motherhood were both the most fulfilling and most isolating of my life. I loved Danny with a fierce intensity that surprised me, spending hours watching him sleep, cataloging every expression that crossed his tiny face, marveling at the miracle of this little person we had created. But I also missed the intellectual stimulation of teaching, the satisfaction of watching young minds grasp new concepts, the camaraderie of the faculty lounge. I tried to mention returning to work when Danny started kindergarten, but Robert shut down the conversation immediately. "We don't need the money," he said, which was true. His accounting practice had grown substantially, and we had moved to a larger house on the better side of Riverside. "Danny needs you here when he gets home from school. You don't want to be one of those mothers who puts her career ahead of her children, do you?" The implications stung, as it was meant to. Robert had a way of framing things that made disagreement seem selfish or unreasonable. So I stayed home, channeling my energy into making our house a showcase, volunteering at Danny's school, and organizing playdates and birthday parties that other mothers envied. I told myself I was lucky to have a husband who could provide for us so well, lucky to be able to focus entirely on my family. As Danny grew older, I began to notice troubling patterns in his behavior. He was charming and well-behaved around adults, especially his father, but he could be cruel to other children when he thought no one was watching. I saw him push a smaller boy off the playground equipment at school one day, then run to help him up when the teacher turned around, wearing an expression of innocent concern that chilled me. When I tried to discuss these incidents with Robert, he dismissed my concerns. "Boys will be boys," he would say. Or, "Danny's just assertive. That's a good quality in a man." I learned to keep my worries to myself, doubting my own perceptions, when they contradicted Robert's unwavering belief in his son's perfection. Danny excelled academically and socially throughout high school, graduating as valedictorian and earning a full scholarship to the University of Illinois. Robert beamed, with pride at every achievement, already planning Danny's future in the family accounting business. I was proud too, but I also felt a growing distance between myself and this accomplished young man who bore so little resemblance to the sweet baby I had once known. College changed Danny, or perhaps it simply revealed who he had always been, beneath the surface. He came home for holidays with an air of sophistication that made him seem older than his years, regaling us with stories of his academic successes and social conquests. He spoke dismissively of his professors, his classmates, anyone he deemed intellectually inferior, which seemed to include most of the world. It was during his junior year that Danny met Jessica at a fraternity formal. She was studying business administration at Northwestern, the daughter of a successful real estate developer from Oak Park. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was beautiful in that polished way that money can buy, with straight blonde hair that never seemed to move, and clothes that fit perfectly without ever looking expensive. Robert was immediately smitten with her, praising her poise and intelligence, her family's social standing, her obvious good breeding. I tried to like Jessica. I really did. She was unfailingly polite, always bringing the perfect hostess gift when she visited, always saying the right things about my cooking and decorating. But there was something cold about her perfection, something calculating in the way she observed our family dynamics, cataloging information for future use. Their engagement came as no surprise, announced at a family dinner during Danny's senior year with all the fanfare Robert could muster. The ring was enormous, a princess-cut diamond that caught the light like a disco ball, nothing like the modest solitaire Robert had given me all those years ago. Jessica extended her hand for admiration with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. The wedding was everything I had never wanted for myself, but somehow found myself planning anyway. Jessica's mother, Patricia. Whitman swept into our lives like a hurricane, armed with opinion about everything from the flower arrangements to the guest list. She treated me with the polite condescension reserved for people she considered beneath her social station, making it clear that while my input was tolerated, the real decisions would be made by people who understood proper society. The ceremony took place at an exclusive country club in Oak Park with 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. I watched my son marry this woman who made my skin crawl, smiling and playing the role of the proud mother while inside I mourned for the future I had hoped he would choose. After the wedding, Danny and Jessica settled into a sprawling house in Oak Park, a wedding gift from her parents that cost more than Robert and I had paid for our home. Danny joined his father-in-law's real estate empire rather than the family accounting business, a decision that wounded Robert more than he let on. I could see the disappointment in his eyes when Danny announced his new career path, though he covered it with congratulations and praise for his son's ambition. The grandchildren arrived in quick succession, Emma first, then Lucas 2 years later. I had hoped that becoming a grandmother would restore some closeness with Danny, that seeing him as a father would remind me of the sweet child he had once been. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Danny was gentle with his children when they were babies, marveling at their tiny fingers and toes, carrying them around the house with obvious pride. But as the children grew older, I watched Danny repeat the patterns Robert had established with him. Emma was praised for her beauty and social skills, groomed to be the perfect little princess who would marry well and enhance the family's status. Lucas was pushed toward achievement and success, his worth measured by his grades and his ability to excel in competitive sports. Jessica proved to be a formidable mother, organizing the children's lives with military precision. Ballet lessons. For Emma, piano lessons for both children, advanced academic programs, exclusive summer camps. Their schedules were packed from morning until night, leaving little time for the simple pleasures of childhood. When I suggested that the children might benefit from unstructured playtime, Jessica smiled that perfect smile and explained that successful families didn't leave their children's futures to chance. My role in their lives was carefully circumscribed. I was welcome to attend recitals and soccer games, to provide babysitting when convenient, to contribute financially to their activities and education. But I was not consulted about important decisions, not included in planning their futures, not treated as anything more than a supportive background figure. The transformation was so gradual that I barely noticed it happening. Birthday invitations, that used to arrive weeks in advance now, came with only a few days' notice. Family dinners became less frequent, and when they did occur, the conversation revolved around Danny and Jessica's achievements, their social activities, their business successes. I found myself nodding and smiling, playing the role of the admiring mother and mother-in-law while feeling increasingly irrelevant to their lives. Robert seemed oblivious to the subtle shifts in family dynamics, or perhaps he chose not to see them. He was so proud of Danny's success, so impressed by Jessica's sophistication, so delighted with his beautiful grandchildren. When I tried to voice my concerns about feeling excluded, he would pat my hand and tell me I was being too sensitive. "They're busy people," he would say. "They don't mean anything by it." But I knew they did mean something by it. I could see it in the way Jessica's eyes would narrow when I offered unsolicited advice, in the way Danny would change the subject when I mentioned missing the children, in the polite but firm way they declined my invitations to simple family activities in favor of more prestigious social engagements. The final years of Robert's life brought his own health struggles into sharp focus. He had always been robust, rarely sick, never one to complain about aches and pains. So when he started having trouble catching his breath during his morning walks, when he began napping in his chair after dinner, when he lost interest in the accounting practice he had built from nothing, I knew something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October. Congestive heart failure, advanced and aggressive. The cardiologist was kind but direct. With medication and lifestyle changes, Robert might have 2 years, maybe 3 if we were lucky. Without treatment, 6 months at most. I sat in that sterile office, holding Robert's hand while the doctor explained treatment options and quality of life considerations, and felt my world tilt on its axis. Robert took the news with characteristic stoicism. He had always been a practical man, someone who faced problems head-on rather than dwelling on emotions. "We'll make the best of whatever time we have left," he told me on the drive home, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. No point in feeling sorry for ourselves. I called Danny as soon as we got home, expecting him to drop everything and rush over. Instead, he listened to my tearful explanation with what sounded like mild interest, asking practical questions about treatment plans and prognosis. "I'll try to stop by this weekend," he said before hanging up, as if his father's terminal diagnosis was just another item on his busy schedule. When he did visit 3 days later, he brought Jessica and the children. Emma was 15 then, tall and beautiful like her mother, absorbed in her phone and clearly resentful of being dragged away from more important activities. Lucas was 13, already showing signs of the Thompson arrogance, polite but distant with his grandfather. The visit lasted exactly an hour. Danny spent most of it discussing business with Robert, asking about insurance policies and financial arrangements with the kind of detached professionalism he might use with any client. Jessica made appropriate sympathetic noises while keeping one eye on her watch, clearly calculating how long they needed to stay to fulfill their family obligations. The children hugged their grandfather goodbye with perfunctory affection, already focused on their next destination. As they prepared to leave, Danny pulled me aside. "You should start thinking about what you'll do after," he said quietly. "Dad's been carrying you financially for years. You'll need to make some changes." The comment hit me like a physical blow. After 43 years of marriage, after giving up my career to raise his child, after decades of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own, my son was already planning for my obsolescence. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out everything I had sacrificed for this family. Instead, I nodded and thanked him for his concern, playing the role of the grateful dependent I had somehow become. Robert's decline was faster than the doctors had predicted. Within 6 months, he was using a wheelchair most of the time, his breath coming in short, painful gasps that broke my heart. I became his full-time caregiver, learning to manage medications and monitor symptoms, sleeping in the chair beside his bed when the nights were particularly difficult. Danny visited occasionally, always with Jessica, always with a sense of duty rather than love. He would sit stiffly in the living room, making stilted conversation about the weather or current events while Robert struggled to stay awake long enough to enjoy his son's company. Jessica would compliment my caregiving efforts with the kind of patronizing approval she might bestow on a particularly efficient servant. The children stopped coming altogether after Christmas. Emma was preparing for her SATs and college applications, Jessica explained. Lucas had made the varsity basketball team and couldn't miss practice. Their grandfather's final months were less important than their academic and social achievements, a priority system that would have appalled me if I hadn't become numb to their casual cruelty. Robert died on a Wednesday morning in March, slipping away peacefully in his sleep while I held his hand. I had been expecting it for weeks, watching him grow weaker and more distant, but nothing could have prepared me for the crushing loneliness of that moment. The man who had been my constant companion for over 4 decades was gone, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and echoing. I called Danny through my tears, barely able to form the words. His response was immediate and efficient. "I'll handle the arrangements," he said, as if planning a business conference rather than his father's funeral. "Don't worry about anything, Mom. Jessica and I will take care of everything." And they did take care of everything, in their own particular way. The funeral was held at Patricia Whitman's country club, rather than the simple church service Robert had requested. The flowers were elaborate and expensive, chosen for their visual impact rather than their meaning. The guest list included business, associates and social acquaintances who barely knew Robert, while some of his oldest friends were somehow overlooked. I felt like a stranger at my own husband's funeral, dressed in a black suit Jessica had insisted I buy for the occasion, sitting in the front row while Danny delivered a eulogy that made Robert sound like a business mentor rather than a beloved father. The whole event felt like a performance designed to enhance the family's reputation rather than honor the man we had lost. It was after the service, as the last mourners were filing out, that Danny leaned close to whisper those devastating words in my ear. "Now, we can finally get rid of you, Mom." The casual cruelty of it, the calculated timing, the complete absence of love or respect, told me everything I needed to know about my future with this family I had spent my life serving. Standing there with Robert's ashes in my hands, I realized that my real journey was just beginning. The woman who had defined herself entirely through her relationships to others was about to discover who she might become when stripped of those familiar roles. The scared, dependent widow holding her husband's remains had no idea that she was about to embark on the most important transformation of her life. The funeral director was waiting patiently for me to sign the final papers, his expression appropriately solemn as he handed me a leather portfolio containing certificates and documentation. But all I could think about was Danny's whispered threat and the cold satisfaction I had seen in Jessica's eyes when she thought no one was looking. They had already written me off, already planned my exile from the family I had created. What they didn't know was that Margaret Thompson was about to surprise them all. The week following Robert's funeral passed in a haze of paperwork and condolence casseroles that I had no appetite to eat. The house on Maple Street felt cavernous without Robert's presence, every room echoing with memories and the absence of his familiar sounds. I found myself listening for his footsteps on the hardwood floors, waiting for him to call my name from his study, expecting to see him dozing in his favorite armchair when I walked into the living room. Danny had made himself scarce since the funeral, claiming he needed time to process his grief privately. Jessica sent a perfunctory text message every few days asking if I needed anything, but her offers felt hollow, obligatory gestures designed to maintain appearances rather than genuine concern. Emma and Lucas hadn't contacted me at all, their silence speaking volumes about where I ranked in their priorities now that their grandfather was gone. I spent those first days moving through the motions of widowhood like a sleepwalker. I sorted through Robert's clothes, deciding what to donate and what to keep for sentimental reasons. I organized his papers, contacted his clients to inform them of his passing, and began the tedious process of closing accounts and transferring assets. The business side of death was overwhelming, a maze of bureaucracy that seemed designed to torture the grieving. It was Linda Martinez who finally forced me out of my self-imposed isolation. My neighbor of 15 years appeared at my front door on a Thursday morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression I remembered from our days volunteering together at the church food pantry. "Enough hiding," she announced, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "You look terrible, and this house smells like sadness and leftover tuna casserole." Linda had always been direct to the point of bluntness, a quality that had sometimes irritated me, but now felt like exactly what I needed. She settled herself at my kitchen table and poured 2 cups of coffee from her thermos, sliding one across, to me with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge. "Talk to me, Maggie, and don't give me any of that 'I'm fine' nonsense. We've been friends too long for polite lies." So I told her, not everything, not about Danny's cruel whisper at the funeral, but enough to convey the overwhelming sense of displacement I was feeling. I talked about the loneliness, the confusion about what came next, the way I felt like a stranger in my own life now that Robert was gone. Linda listened without interrupting, her dark eyes reflecting the kind of understanding that comes from surviving your own share of loss. Her husband Carlos had died 3 years earlier in a construction accident, leaving her to raise 2 teenagers on a secretary's salary. If anyone understood the particular devastation of sudden widowhood, it was Linda. You know what your problem is? She said, when I finally ran out of words. You've been Mrs. Robert Thompson for so long, you've forgotten how to be just Maggie. And now that he's gone, you're scared you don't exist without him. Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. I had subsumed my identity so completely into my roles as wife, mother, and grandmother that I genuinely didn't know who I was as an individual. Every decision I had made for decades had been filtered through what Robert would want, what was best for Danny, what would serve the family's interests. The idea of making choices based solely on my own desires felt foreign and frightening. So, what do? I asked, hearing the lost quality in my own voice. How do I figure out who I'm supposed to be now? Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her calloused fingers warm against my cold skin. You start small. You remember things you used to love before you became someone else's everything. You try new things. You make mistakes. You give yourself permission to be selfish for the first time in your life. It sounded so simple when she said it, but the reality felt overwhelming. I couldn't remember the last time I had made a decision based purely on what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. The few times I had expressed personal preferences over the years, Robert or Danny had found ways to redirect me toward more practical or appropriate choices. Linda must have seen the doubt in my expression because she leaned forward, her voice taking on the fierce intensity I remembered from her advocacy work with domestic violence survivors. Listen to me, Maggie. You're 67 years old, not 97. You could have 20 or 30 good years ahead of you. Are you going to spend them waiting for permission to live your own life? Her words sparked something in me, a tiny flame of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to discover who Margaret Thompson could be when she wasn't defined entirely by her relationships to other people. That evening, for the first time since Robert's death, I called Danny. I had been putting off the conversation about my future, dreading the implications of his whispered threat at the funeral. But Linda's visit had given me courage, or perhaps just the realization that avoiding the topic wouldn't make it disappear. Danny answered on the fourth ring, his voice distracted in the way that suggested I was interrupting something more important. Hey, Mom, how are you holding up? I'm managing, I replied, settling into Robert's chair with the phone pressed to my ear. I wanted to talk to you about practical matters. The house, my finances, what happens next? There was a pause, and I could hear him typing in the background, probably responding to emails while talking to his grieving mother. Yeah, Jessica and I have been discussing that. Obviously, the house is too big for you now, and the maintenance costs are going to eat into your fixed income. We think you should consider selling. The casual way he dismissed the home where I had lived for over 30 years, where I had raised him, where every room held memories of our family's history, took my breath away. This is my home, Danny. Your father and I built our life here. Dad's gone, Mom. His tone was patient but firm, the voice he might use with a confused elderly client. You need to be practical about your situation. The real estate market is strong right now. You could make a nice profit and use that money to buy something smaller, more manageable. And where exactly do you suggest I live? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. There's a lovely senior community in Brookfield, Willowbrook Manor. Jessica's grandmother lived there before she passed, and she was very happy. It's got all kinds of activities, a dining room so you don't have to cook, housekeeping services. You'd probably make friends. The suggestion hit me like a slap. Danny was essentially recommending that I voluntarily enter what amounted to a warehouse for inconvenient elderly relatives. Willowbrook Manor was where families deposited their aging parents when they became too much trouble to maintain in their own homes. I'm not ready for assisted living, Danny. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. For now, he agreed. But let's be realistic about the future. You're not getting any younger. And when your health starts to decline, you'll need support systems in place. It's better to make the transition while you're still healthy enough to adapt. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Danny systematically dismantling every objection I raised. He had clearly given this considerable thought, probably discussing my future with Jessica over dinner like they were planning a business strategy. Every concern I expressed was met with patient explanations of why my feelings were impractical or short-sighted. By the time we hung up, I felt like I had been steamrolled by a particularly efficient bulldozer. Danny had made it clear that my continued residence in the family home was temporary at best, that my financial situation was more precarious than I had realized, and that my options were limited. He promised to come by over the weekend to go through Robert's papers more thoroughly and help me understand my realistic options. I sat in Robert's chair long after the call ended, staring at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. There was our wedding picture, young and hopeful in black and white, Danny's high school graduation, his face beaming with pride and possibility, Christmas mornings with the grandchildren, their faces bright with excitement as they tore open presents I had carefully chosen and wrapped. When had I become such a burden to the family I had devoted my life to creating? When had my needs become inconveniences to be managed rather than concerns to be addressed with love and respect? I tried to remember the last time Danny had asked what I wanted rather than telling me what I should do, but no specific instance came to mind. The next few days brought a parade of visitors, each arrival adding another layer to my growing understanding of how completely I had been marginalized in my own family's plans. Patricia Henderson, Robert's longtime attorney, came by to discuss the will and estate planning. Her news was sobering but not entirely unexpected. "Robert left everything to you, of course," she explained, spreading documents across my dining room table with practiced efficiency. The house, the investment accounts, his portion of the accounting practice. "But Maggie, I have to be honest with you about your financial situation." She walked me through the numbers with the kind of gentle authority that suggested she had delivered similar news to other widows in my situation. Robert's medical expenses over the final year had been substantial, even with insurance. The accounting practice, while successful, had suffered during his illness as he transferred clients to other firms or reduced his workload. The investments, that had seemed solid a few years ago, had lost value in recent market fluctuations. "You're not destitute," Patricia assured me, "but you're not as financially secure as Robert might have led you to believe. The house is your most significant asset, and the property taxes alone are going to strain your budget going forward." It was the same message Danny had delivered, but hearing it from a neutral professional made it feel more real and less like manipulation. I was facing a future with limited financial resources and unlimited uncertainty, dependent on the goodwill of a son who had already made his intentions clear. Patricia's visit was followed by Frank Miller, the handyman who had maintained our property for over a decade. Frank was a gentleman in his 60s, soft-spoken and reliable, the kind of person who took pride in doing honest work for fair pay. He had asked to stop by to express his condolences and discuss the spring maintenance schedule. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, standing awkwardly in my kitchen while I poured him coffee, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but this house is going to need some significant work in the next few years. The roof is showing its age, the furnace will need replacing soon, and the electrical system should probably be updated." He wasn't trying to drum up business. Frank had always been scrupulously honest about what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. But his assessment painted a picture of mounting expenses that my reduced income couldn't support. Every conversation seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. Staying in the house wasn't just impractical, it was financially impossible. The weekend brought Danny and Jessica as promised, arriving Saturday morning with briefcases and the kind of organizational materials that suggested they had prepared for this meeting like a business presentation. Emma and Lucas were notably absent, shipped off to friends' houses or activities that were more important than helping their grandmother navigate her grief and uncertainty. Jessica had brought coffee from an expensive cafe in Oak Park and pastries that probably cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. She arranged everything on my kitchen table with the kind of calculated thoughtfulness that was designed to make her appear caring while keeping emotional distance. "We've been doing some research, Mom," Danny began, opening his laptop and pulling up what appeared to be a detailed financial spreadsheet. "Looking at your options, considering your long-term needs, trying to find solutions that make sense for everyone." The phrase "make sense for everyone" immediately put me on guard. In my experience, when Danny said something made sense for everyone, it usually meant it served his interests while requiring sacrifices from others. He walked me through their analysis with the thoroughness of a business consultant presenting to a client. They had researched property values, calculated maintenance costs, compared the expenses of independent living versus assisted living facilities. They had even contacted several real estate agents to get preliminary assessments of what the house might bring in the current market. "The bottom line," Jessica said, her manicured finger tracing across columns of numbers, "is that keeping the house doesn't make financial sense. You'd be house poor within 2 years, struggling to afford basic maintenance while sitting on an asset that could fund a much more comfortable retirement." They had found what they considered the perfect solution. Sunset Gardens was a senior living community about an hour outside Chicago, nestled in a rural setting that they described as peaceful and scenic. It offered various levels of care, from independent apartments to full assisted living, allowing residents to age in place without the trauma of multiple relocations. "It's really lovely, Mom," Danny said, showing me photos on his laptop screen. "The apartments are spacious and modern. There's a full activities calendar, restaurant-quality dining, even a small library. You'd have built-in social opportunities without the isolation you're experiencing here." The pictures were indeed attractive. Sunset Gardens looked like a resort more than a nursing home, with manicured gardens and elegant common areas. The apartments were nicely appointed, with modern kitchenettes and private balconies overlooking landscaped courtyards. But every image reinforced the same message. This was a place where people went to wait for death with dignity and minimal inconvenience to their families. "What about my friends here?" I asked. I sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the evidence of his desperate attempts to buy time he couldn't afford, and felt the last vestiges of my anger dissolve into pure terror. Robert hadn't been cruel or calculating in hiding this from me. He had been protecting me from the knowledge that we were sliding toward financial ruin, probably hoping he would recover enough to find a solution before I discovered the truth. The phone rang while I was still processing the magnitude of our debt. Danny's voice was bright with false cheer, the tone he used when he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Good news, Mom. I've set up an appointment for you to tour Sunset Gardens tomorrow afternoon. Jessica cleared her schedule to drive you out there, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what they have to offer." "Danny, I need to talk to you about something important. I found some papers in your father's desk that—" "Whatever it is can wait until after you've seen the facility," he interrupted smoothly. "I don't want anything to cloud your judgment about this opportunity. Sunset Gardens only has a few units available, and we don't want to miss out because you're dwelling on the past." The dismissive way he cut off my attempt to discuss our family's financial crisis told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. Danny didn't want to hear about problems that might complicate his carefully orchestrated plan to relocate me. He wanted a grateful, compliant mother who would accept his solutions without creating inconvenient complications. "I'm not going," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I need time to sort through your father's affairs, and I'm not making any major decisions until I understand the full situation." There was a pause, and when Danny spoke again, his voice had shifted from cheerful persuasion to cool authority. "Mom, I understand you're overwhelmed, but that's exactly why you need professional guidance. Jessica has researched this extensively. And we've found solutions that address all your concerns. Refusing to even look at your options isn't helping anyone. My concerns include some significant financial issues that you apparently don't want to discuss. Whatever Dad left behind, we'll figure it out. But right now, the priority is getting you settled somewhere safe and appropriate. You can't stay in that house indefinitely, and the longer you wait to make decisions, the fewer choices you'll have. The implied threat was clear: cooperate with their timeline, or face even more limited options later. Danny had always been skilled at creating false urgency to pressure people into decisions that served his interests. I had watched him use the same tactics with Robert, presenting business proposals with artificial deadlines that prevented careful consideration. I said I'm not going tomorrow, and I meant it. When I'm ready to consider moving, I'll let you know. Another pause, longer this time. I see. Well, I suppose if you're determined to make this difficult, there's nothing I can do to stop you. But Mom, I hope you understand that Jessica and I can't put our lives on hold indefinitely while you figure things out. We have our own responsibilities and commitments. The conversation ended with polite goodbyes that felt more like a declaration of war than family concern. I hung up knowing that I had crossed a line, moving from manageable inconvenience to active resistance in Danny's mind. The grateful, dependent mother he expected had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize and couldn't control. Within hours, the consequences of my defiance began to manifest. Jessica called while I was heating soup for dinner, her voice dripping, with the kind of syrupy concern that barely concealed her irritation. "Maggie, Danny told me you're having second thoughts about touring Sunset Gardens. I completely understand how overwhelming this must be for you, but I'm worried that you're not thinking clearly about your situation." My thinking is perfectly clear, Jessica. I'm not ready to make major life changes while I'm still grieving and trying to understand my financial position. Of course not, she agreed, in the tone one might use with a confused child. That's exactly why you need expert guidance. You shouldn't have to navigate these complex decisions alone, especially when you're dealing with grief and the stress of managing Robert's affairs. She launched into a detailed explanation of why immediate action was necessary, peppered with statistics about real estate markets and vacancy rates at quality senior communities. Every point was designed to create urgency while making my hesitation seem irrational and self-destructive. The truth is, Maggie, opportunities like Sunset Gardens don't wait for people to overcome their emotional resistance to change. If you're not ready to move forward, they'll offer the apartment to someone who is. And then, where will you be? The question hung in the air like a threat, though Jessica's tone remained helpful and concerned throughout. She was painting a picture of a future where my stubbornness would leave me with no good options, forced to accept whatever arrangements others made for me when I finally came to my senses. The next morning brought Linda Martinez to my doorstep again, this time carrying a bag of groceries and wearing an expression of determined friendship that I had come to associate with her rescue missions. "I brought coffee and those pastries you like from the Mexican bakery," she announced, pushing past me into the kitchen. "And I'm not leaving until you tell me what's really going on. Danny called Carlos last night asking about handyman services for getting your house ready to sell. Since when did you decide to move?" I found myself telling her everything again. But this time, the story included Robert's hidden debts and the impossible choice between financial ruin and voluntary exile. Linda listened with growing outrage, occasionally muttering Spanish phrases that I suspected were not complimentary to my son's character. "So let me understand this," she said when I finished. "Your husband left you with debts you can't pay. Your son is pressuring you to sell your home and move to a senior warehouse. And when you ask for time to figure things out, he basically threatens to abandon you if you don't cooperate with his timeline." Put that way, the situation sounded even worse than it felt. He's not threatening to abandon me. He's just pointing out that he has his own life to live. Linda fixed me with the look she reserved for people who were being deliberately obtuse. "Maggie, wake up. Your son is manipulating you into giving up everything you have left so he doesn't have to deal with the inconvenience of an aging parent. And he's using your grief and confusion to pressure you into decisions that serve his interests, not yours." Her blunt assessment stung because it rang true. Danny's concern for my welfare seemed directly proportional to how much my situation inconvenienced him. When I was the grateful, manageable widow following his suggestions, he was attentive and helpful. The moment I showed signs of independent thinking, his patience evaporated. "But what choice do I have?" I asked, gesturing helplessly at the stack of bills on my kitchen table. "The numbers don't lie. I can't afford to stay here, and I don't have the resources to maintain this house on my own." Linda studied the financial documents with the practical eye of someone who had managed on limited income for years. "These medical bills. Have you contacted the billing departments to set up payment plans? Most hospitals will work with you if you're honest about your situation." I admitted I hadn't thought to negotiate with creditors, accepting the stated amounts as unchangeable facts. Linda spent the next hour on the phone with me, calling billing departments and explaining my circumstances. To my amazement, several agreed to reduce the amounts owed or accept minimal monthly payments that fit within my budget. "The second mortgage is still a problem," she said, reviewing the loan documents with a frown. "But even that might be negotiable if you talk to the right people. Banks don't want to foreclose if they can avoid it. The process is expensive and time-consuming, and they usually recover more money through modified payment plans." By the end of the morning, my financial crisis looked manageable rather than catastrophic. It would require careful budgeting and some lifestyle adjustments. But staying in my home wasn't the impossibility Danny had presented. The revelation that I had been manipulated with selective information rather than objective facts transformed my fear into fury. That afternoon, I called Danny back. "I've been reviewing the financial situation more carefully," I told him, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I think there are solutions you haven't considered." "Mom, please don't tell me you're still resisting the obvious answer to your problems. Jessica spent hours researching options for you, and Jessica researched options that serve your convenience, not my needs," I interrupted, my patience finally exhausted. "You want me out of this house so you don't have to worry about supporting me or dealing with my problems. But I'm not your problem to solve, Danny. I'm your mother, and I deserve better than being manipulated into decisions that benefit you more than they benefit me." The silence that followed my outburst was so complete, I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Danny finally spoke, his voice was cold with barely controlled anger. "I see. So now Jessica and I are the villains for trying to help you face reality. We're manipulative and selfish for spending our time and energy finding solutions to problems you can't handle yourself." "I never said you were villains. But your solutions seem designed more to remove me from your lives than to support my well-being." "Maybe that's because supporting your well-being is becoming a full-time job that interferes with our ability to live our own lives. Did you ever consider that, Mom? Did you ever think that maybe we have other priorities besides managing your emotional resistance to growing older?" The mask had finally slipped. Danny wasn't the devoted son making sacrifices for his aging mother. He was a man inconvenienced by family obligations that interfered with his preferred lifestyle, looking for the most efficient way to discharge his duties without ongoing commitment. "I never asked you to manage my life, Danny. I asked for support, while I grieved your father and figured out my next steps. Instead, you decided what was best for me and tried to manipulate me into accepting it. Jesus, Mom, listen to yourself. You sound paranoid. Nobody's manipulating you. We're trying to help you avoid making mistakes that will hurt you later. But if you want to stay in that house until the bank forecloses and you end up in some state-run facility because you were too stubborn to accept help when it was offered, that's your choice." The conversation deteriorated from there. Years of suppressed resentment and unspoken frustrations erupting in accusations and counter-accusations that left us both raw and angry. By the time we hung up, it was clear that our relationship had shifted into open conflict, with neither side willing to back down from positions that seemed irreconcilable. That evening, Emma called. My granddaughter's voice was careful and measured, suggesting she was delivering a message rather than speaking. Spontaneously, "Hi, Grandma. I heard you and Dad had a disagreement about your living situation." "We had a discussion about my future, yes. How are you doing, sweetheart? I feel like I haven't talked to you in weeks." "I'm fine. Busy with school and college prep, you know. But Grandma, I wanted to say something about the whole moving thing. I think maybe Dad and Mom are right that you should consider all your options." The stilted quality of her speech made it clear that Emma was repeating talking points rather than expressing her own thoughts. Jessica had clearly coached her on what to say, using my granddaughter as another source of pressure to accept their preferred solution. "What options do you think I should consider, Emma?" "Well, staying in that big house all by yourself seems kind of sad and lonely. And if you moved somewhere with activities and other people your age, you might be happier. Plus, it would be easier for us to visit you if you were in a nice facility with structured visiting hours and stuff." The structured visiting hours comment revealed more than Emma probably intended. Danny and Jessica weren't just trying to relocate me. They were looking for an arrangement that would limit and control our interactions, reducing their family obligations to scheduled appointments that could be managed around their other priorities. "Emma, do you want to visit me less than you do now?" There was a pause, and when she answered, her voice sounded younger and less certain. "It's not that I don't want to visit. It's just that everything is so complicated now, with Dad being upset and Mom saying we need to give you space to process your grief. I miss hanging out with you, but I don't want to make things worse for everyone." The conversation broke my heart because it revealed how my conflict with Danny was affecting the grandchildren I loved. Emma was caught between loyalty to her parents and affection for me, forced to navigate adult conflicts that she didn't understand and shouldn't have to manage. After we hung up, I sat in my darkening living room and contemplated the full scope of my isolation. Robert was gone. Danny and Jessica were actively working against my interests. My grandchildren were being coached to support their parents' agenda. Even my church community had faded away during Robert's illness, leaving me with only Linda's friendship as a reliable source of support. The doorbell rang while I was wallowing in self-pity, and I opened it to find Carol Williams from across the street holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of neighborly concern. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced," she said, stepping into my foyer without waiting for an invitation. "I've been meaning to check on you since Robert's service, but I didn't want to intrude while family was visiting." Carol and I had been acquaintances rather than close friends, exchanging pleasantries at the mailbox and borrowing the occasional cup of sugar, but never developing the kind of relationship that transcended neighborly courtesy. Her unexpected visit caught me off guard, especially when she settled herself in my living room as if she planned to stay for a while. "I brought you some of my famous lasagna," she announced, "and I wanted to talk to you about something I overheard. That's been bothering me." She had apparently been in her front yard the previous afternoon when Danny and Jessica arrived for what had clearly been intended as an intervention. Their voices had carried across the street as they argued about strategy on my front porch, debating whether to take a harder line or continue with gentle persuasion. "I don't like to gossip," Carol said, though her expression suggested she was about to do exactly that. "But some of the things they said about you and your situation didn't sit right with me. It sounded like they were planning to force you out of your home whether you wanted to go or not." Her confirmation that I wasn't imagining the manipulation should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel exposed and pitied. The idea that my neighbors were witnessing my family's attempts to dispose of me added humiliation to my growing list of grievances. "I probably shouldn't get involved," Carol continued, But my mother went through something similar with my brother and sister-in-law about 10 years ago. They convinced her to sell her house and move to a retirement community, promising they'd visit regularly and stay involved in her life. She paused to sip the tea I had automatically prepared, her expression growing sad. She died 3 years later, and I don't think either of them visited more than a dozen times total. They got what they wanted, which was not having to worry about her anymore, and she got a sterile apartment where she knew nobody and had nothing to do but wait for phone calls that rarely came. The story chilled me because I could see the same future stretching ahead if I capitulated to Danny's pressure. Once I was safely warehoused at Sunset Gardens, his sense of filial duty would be satisfied, and his actual involvement in my life would dwindle to occasional duty visits and holiday phone calls. Carol's visit stretched into the evening, and I found myself confiding details about my situation that I hadn't shared with anyone except Linda. She listened with the practical sympathy of someone who had navigated her own family crises, offering insights that came from experience rather than obligation. "The thing is," she said as she prepared to leave, "nobody can force you to sell your house unless you're mentally incompetent or financially unable to meet your obligations. From what you've told me, you're neither. Your son might not like your decisions, but he can't override them just because he thinks he knows better." Her words echoed Linda's assessment, reinforcing the growing realization that I had more power in this situation than Danny wanted me to believe. The combination of grief, financial stress, and family pressure had convinced me that I was helpless, dependent on others' goodwill for my survival. But the reality was more complex and more hopeful than the picture Danny had painted. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to fight for my right to determine my own future, regardless of who that inconvenienced or offended. Danny and Jessica could disapprove of my choices, withdraw their support, or threaten consequences, but they couldn't force me to accept solutions that served their interests more than mine. The next morning, I called Patricia Henderson and scheduled an appointment to discuss my legal options. I contacted Linda to ask for referrals to financial counselors who specialized in helping seniors manage debt and protect assets. I even researched home modification services that could help me age in place safely and independently. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was taking control of my life, rather than simply reacting to other people's plans for me. The scared, dependent widow who had been manipulated by financial pressure and emotional blackmail was being replaced by someone stronger and more determined than I had been in years. Danny called that afternoon, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was making one final attempt at reasonable persuasion before escalating to more serious measures. "Mom, I think we need to have a face-to-face conversation about where we go from here. This phone tag isn't productive for anyone, and there are decisions that can't be postponed indefinitely." "I agree," I said, my own voice steady despite my racing heart. "But this time, we're going to discuss my preferences instead of your predetermined solutions. And Danny, I want you to understand something clearly. I am not a problem for you to solve. I am your mother, and I deserve to be treated with respect and consideration, not managed like an inconvenient obligation." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. When Danny finally responded, his voice carried an edge I had never heard before, cold and calculating in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the calculating child who had pushed smaller kids off playground equipment. "Fine, Mom. We'll do this your way. But don't say I didn't warn you about the consequences when your stubbornness catches up with you." The threat was vague but unmistakable, and it told me everything I needed to know about the battle that lay ahead. Danny wasn't going to accept my independence gracefully. If gentle manipulation wouldn't work, he was prepared to use harder tactics to achieve his objectives. But I was no longer the frightened, confused woman who had stood in this kitchen a week ago, overwhelmed by financial documents and family pressure. I was Margaret Thompson, and I was finally ready to fight for my own life. The transformation didn't happen overnight. but it began with a single phone call to Dr. Rachel Stone, a therapist specializing in late-life transitions who Linda had recommended. I had never considered therapy before, viewing it as something for people with serious mental health issues rather than ordinary widows trying to navigate family conflicts. But sitting in Dr. Stone's comfortable office 3 days later, I realized how desperately I needed someone objective to help me sort through the chaos my life had become. Dr. Stone was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of Linda's no-nonsense approach to problem-solving. She listened to my story without judgment, occasionally asking questions that forced me to examine assumptions I hadn't realized I was making. "Tell me about your relationship with Danny before Robert's illness," she said during our second session. "Was he always this controlling, or has something changed?" The question made me pause and really consider the patterns I had accepted as normal family dynamics. "He's always been strong-willed," I admitted. "Even as a child, he knew what he wanted and found ways to get it. But I think I excused it as leadership potential or healthy ambition. And now? Now it feels like he sees me as an obstacle to his preferred lifestyle, rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration." Dr. Stone nodded thoughtfully. Grief can reveal character in unexpected ways. Some people become more compassionate when faced with loss, while others become more focused on protecting themselves from inconvenience or emotional discomfort. It sounds like Danny might be in the second category. Our sessions became a lifeline during the weeks that followed, providing me with tools to recognize manipulation tactics and strategies for maintaining boundaries with family members who didn't respect my autonomy. Dr. Stone helped me understand that feeling guilty for prioritizing my own needs was a learned response, not a natural law, and that I had the right to make decisions about my life even if others disapproved. Meanwhile, my meeting with Patricia Henderson had yielded surprising results. After reviewing my financial situation in detail, she recommended a bankruptcy attorney who specialized in protecting seniors' assets from creditor claims. The idea of declaring bankruptcy at 67 was humiliating, but it would allow me to keep my house while establishing manageable payment plans for Robert's medical debts. "It's not ideal," Patricia admitted, "but it's designed for exactly these circumstances. You can't be held responsible for medical bills that were incurred without your knowledge, especially when they exceed reasonable expectations for your income level." The legal process was complex and emotionally draining, requiring me to document every aspect of our financial history and Robert's medical care. But it also revealed the extent to which I had been excluded from important decisions about our money and health care, strengthening my resolve to never again allow others to make choices that affected my life without my input. Danny's reaction to my legal maneuvering was swift and predictable. He called the morning after I filed the bankruptcy petition, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing? Patricia Henderson called to inform me that you're declaring bankruptcy. Do you have any idea how this affects the family's reputation?" "It affects my financial situation, which is what matters to me right now," I replied, marveling at my own calm in the face of his anger. "Your reputation will survive my legal problems." "That's not the point. The point is that you're making major decisions without consulting anyone. Decisions that could have long-term consequences you don't understand." I consulted with an attorney and a financial counselor. I'm making informed decisions about my own affairs, which is exactly what you've been telling me I need to do. The conversation escalated quickly, with Danny accusing me of being vindictive and self-destructive, while I pointed out that every alternative he had suggested would have left me homeless and dependent on his continued goodwill. We were no longer pretending to have a normal mother-son relationship built on love and mutual respect. This was a power struggle, pure and simple, and I was no longer willing to concede defeat for the sake of family harmony. "Fine," Danny said finally, his voice cold with finality. "If this is how you want to handle things, don't expect Jessica and me to clean up the mess when your stubbornness backfires. We've tried to help you, but you're obviously determined to Do this the hard way. I'm determined to do this my way, I corrected. And if that means doing it without your help, then I'll manage somehow. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the realization that I had just severed my last connection to the family I had spent my entire adult life serving. It should have felt devastating, but instead I felt oddly liberated, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. Linda arrived within an hour of Danny's call, armed with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine that she declared essential for processing major life changes. We spread the cartons across my kitchen table and talked long into the evening about independence, family obligations, and the courage required to choose authenticity over acceptance. You know what I admire about you? Linda said, refilling our wine glasses with the determination of someone who believed in the therapeutic value of mild intoxication. 3 weeks ago, you were ready to let them ship you off to that senior warehouse without a fight. Now you're taking on bankruptcy court and family pressure like some kind of geriatric warrior. Her assessment made me laugh, but it also made me reflect on how much I had changed in such a short time. The woman who had stood in this kitchen overwhelmed by financial documents and family pressure bore little resemblance to the person who was now actively fighting for her right to self-determination. I think I just got tired of being afraid, I said. Afraid of being alone, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of inconveniencing people who clearly don't care about my well-being anyway. At some point, the fear of giving up my life became stronger than the fear of living it on my own terms. The next few weeks brought a series of small victories that gradually rebuilt my confidence and expanded my sense of possibility. The bankruptcy proceedings moved forward smoothly, with creditors agreeing to payment plans that fit within my limited budget. Frank Miller helped me develop a realistic maintenance schedule for the house that prioritized essential repairs while deferring cosmetic improvements until my financial situation stabilized. More importantly, I began reconnecting with parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the Riverside Community Center, something I had wanted to try since college but had never made time for, during my years of family obligations. The instructor, Helen Rodriguez, was a retired art teacher whose enthusiasm for creative expression was infectious and inspiring. Art isn't about talent, Helen told our small group of mostly older women during the first class. It's about paying attention to the world around you and finding ways to express what you see and feel. Everyone has something unique to contribute if they're brave enough to try. Her words resonated with me on multiple levels, applying as much to life as to painting. I had spent so many years focused on meeting other people's expectations that I had lost touch with my own creative impulses and authentic preferences. The simple act of choosing colors and brush strokes based on what pleased me rather than what others might approve of felt revolutionary. The painting class also introduced me to a community of women facing similar transitions. Martha was a recent widow learning to manage finances after 50 years of marriage. Sue had moved to Riverside to be closer to her children, only to discover they were too busy with their own lives to provide the companionship she had expected. Carol had recently retired from nursing and was struggling to find purpose and identity outside her professional role. We began meeting for coffee after class, then expanded to monthly dinners and occasional day trips to art museums or local festivals. For the first time in years, I had friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligations or neighborhood proximity. These women knew me as Margaret the aspiring artist, not Mrs. Robert Thompson or Danny's problematic mother. My growing social circle provided emotional support during the more difficult aspects of my transformation, particularly when Danny escalated his campaign to pressure me into compliance with his preferred solutions. He began calling other family members, painting me as a confused elderly woman making irrational decisions that endangered her own welfare. Robert's sister Janet called from Arizona, her voice heavy with concern and disapproval. "Maggie, dear, Danny tells me you're refusing reasonable help and making decisions that don't make financial sense. He's worried about your mental state. And frankly, so am I. The conversation was painful because Janet had always been supportive during my marriage to her brother, but she was clearly getting a filtered version of events that cast Danny as the responsible son trying to help an unreasonable mother. I tried to explain my perspective, but Janet's responses made it clear that she had already made up her mind about who was being reasonable and who was being stubborn. Similar calls came from Robert's business partner, our former pastor, and several longtime family friends. Danny was systematically undermining my credibility with anyone who might influence my decisions, portraying my newfound independence as evidence of declining mental capacity rather than healthy self-advocacy. The campaign might have worked if I hadn't developed stronger support systems and clearer understanding of my own worth. Dr. Stone helped me recognize the manipulation tactics Danny was using, while my new friends provided perspective from people who knew me as I was now, rather than as I had been in my previous role as dutiful wife and mother. "Let them think what they want," Helen said when I confided my frustration about the gossip campaign. "People who really know you can see your strength and clarity. The others are just repeating what they've been told without bothering to investigate for themselves." Her advice proved prophetic when Emma called on a Sunday evening, her voice uncertain and confused in a way that suggested she was questioning the narrative her parents had been providing. "Grandma, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I wanted to ask you something. Are you really having mental problems like Dad says? Or are you just making different choices than he wants you to make?" The direct question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "I'm making choices your father doesn't approve of, but my thinking is clearer than it's been in years. What made you ask?" There was a pause. Then Emma's voice came through more quietly, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "I found some papers in Dad's office about that senior place he wants you to move to. It's like he's been planning this for months, even before Grandpa died. And some of the things he wrote about your finances don't match what you told me." My granddaughter's discovery confirmed what I had suspected but couldn't prove. Danny's concern for my welfare was secondary to his desire to resolve what he saw as an inconvenient obligation. He had been researching institutional care options while Robert was still alive, preparing for the day when he would need to dispose of an aging mother who might interfere with his preferred lifestyle. "Emma, I want you to know that you can always call me directly if you want to know what's really happening in my life. Don't rely on secondhand information from people who have their own agenda." "I will, Grandma, and I miss you. I know things are weird with the family right now, but I love you no matter what Dad says about your decisions." Her declaration brought tears to my eyes because it represented the first unconditional support I had received from anyone in my immediate family since Robert's death. Emma might be caught between conflicting loyalties, but she was capable of thinking for herself and reaching her own conclusions about my mental state and motivations. The conversation with Emma marked a turning point in my confidence about the path I had chosen. I was no longer just reacting to other people's pressure or defending my right to make independent decisions. I was actively building a life that reflected my own values and interests, creating new relationships and pursuing activities that brought me joy rather than obligation. The bankruptcy court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, almost 3 months after Robert's death. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that Helen had helped me choose, something that projected competence and dignity rather than the confused frailty Danny's campaign had suggested. Patricia Henderson met me at the courthouse, her presence providing both legal expertise and moral support. The proceedings were less dramatic than I had expected, mostly involving questions about my income, expenses, and ability to maintain realistic payment plans for reduced debt amounts. The judge was professional but kind, clearly familiar with situations where surviving spouses discovered hidden financial obligations that threatened their security. "Mrs. Thompson," he said as the hearing concluded, "I'm approving your petition with the recommended payment plan, but I want to commend You for taking proactive steps to address your situation rather than simply hoping it would resolve itself. Too many people in your circumstances wait until foreclosure proceedings force them into much more difficult circumstances. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I had reclaimed not just my financial stability, but my fundamental right to determine my own future. The scared, dependent woman who had been overwhelmed by Robert's hidden debts no longer existed. In her place was someone who could face problems directly, seek appropriate help, and make difficult decisions based on careful consideration rather than fear or family pressure. That evening, I called Dr. Stone to schedule what I hoped would be one of our final sessions. "I think I'm ready to graduate from therapy," I told her. "I feel like I've learned the skills I need to navigate whatever comes next." "That's wonderful news," she replied, genuine warmth in her voice. "But remember, growth is an ongoing process. Don't hesitate to call if you need support during future transitions or challenges." Her reminder proved prescient sooner than I expected. The next morning brought a certified letter from Danny's attorney, informing me that my son was petitioning for guardianship based on concerns about my mental competency and ability to manage my financial affairs independently. The legal document cited my bankruptcy filing as evidence of poor judgment and included statements from family members and former friends expressing worry about my recent behavior changes. Reading that letter in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my growing independence and renewed sense of purpose, I felt a moment of pure fury that surprised me with its intensity. Danny wasn't content to withdraw his support or express disapproval of my choices. He was attempting to use the legal system to strip away the autonomy I had fought so hard to reclaim. But the fury was quickly replaced by something more powerful and sustainable: determination. I had survived Robert's death, discovered hidden debts that could have destroyed my financial security, navigated complex legal proceedings, and rebuilt my social support systems from scratch. I was not going to be intimidated by a son who confused control with care and manipulation with love. I called Patricia Henderson immediately, then Dr. Stone, then Helen Rodriguez. Within hours, I had assembled a team of professionals and friends who could testify to my mental clarity, financial responsibility, and capacity for independent decision-making. Danny might have family loyalty and financial resources on his side, but I had something more powerful: the truth about my capabilities, and the support of people who knew me as I actually was rather than as I had been portrayed. The battle for my freedom was about to begin in earnest, but I was no longer the frightened, isolated woman who had been easy to manipulate and control. I was Margaret Thompson, and I was finally ready to fight for the life I deserved to live. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a frigid morning in January, exactly 1 year after Robert's first heart episode that had marked the beginning of our descent into medical crisis and financial uncertainty. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from a strange sense of anticipation, as if this day would finally settle questions that had been hanging over my life for months. Patricia Henderson arrived at my house an hour before we needed to leave for court, carrying a thick briefcase and wearing the expression of a lawyer who was confident in her case but understood the stakes involved. We reviewed my testimony one final time, going over the questions Danny's attorney might ask and the evidence we would present to demonstrate my mental competency and decision-making capacity. "Remember," Patricia said as we gathered our materials, "this isn't about proving you're perfect or that you've never made mistakes. It's about demonstrating that you have the cognitive ability to understand your situation, weigh options, and make reasoned decisions about your own life. Everything you've accomplished in the past 6 months supports that conclusion." Dr. Stone met us at the courthouse, along with Helen Rodriguez and 2 other women from my art class who had volunteered to testify about my mental clarity and social engagement. Linda Martinez had driven in from her new job in the suburbs, taking a personal day to support me through what we all understood could be the most important legal proceeding of my life. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Danny sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who exuded the kind of professional confidence that came from winning difficult cases. Jessica was conspicuously absent, though Emma sat in the gallery behind her father, her expression troubled and uncertain. When Danny's attorney, Ms. Brennan, began presenting their case, I was struck by how reasonable their arguments sounded when stripped of emotional context and reduced to legal facts. Margaret Thompson was a 67-year-old widow who had filed for bankruptcy within months of her husband's death. She had rejected family assistance and professional recommendations for appropriate senior housing. She had isolated herself from longtime friends and family members, replacing them with new acquaintances who might not understand her true needs. Ms. Brennan called Janet as her first witness, my former sister-in-law testifying via video link from Arizona. Janet's testimony was devastating precisely because it was delivered with genuine concern and affection. She described phone conversations where I had sounded confused and defensive, rejecting reasonable suggestions from family, members who only wanted to help. Maggie has always been a strong-willed person, Janet said, her voice wavering with emotion. But the woman I've spoken with in recent months doesn't sound like herself. She's making decisions that seem designed to push away the people who care about her most, and that's not the Maggie I've known for 40 years. The portrait that emerged from Janet's testimony was of a grieving widow whose judgment had been compromised by loss and isolation, making choices that appeared independent but were actually self-destructive. It was a compelling narrative that contained enough truth to be believable while omitting crucial context about the family dynamics that had led to my supposed isolation. Danny's testimony was even more effective because it was delivered with the perfect balance of sorrow and determination. He spoke about his love for his mother, his concern for her welfare, and his frustration with her refusal to accept help from people who had her best interests at heart. "My mother taught me to be responsible for family," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he looked directly at the judge. "She sacrificed everything to raise me and support my father through his illness. Now that she needs care and protection, I can't stand by and watch her make decisions that will ultimately hurt her because she's too proud or too confused to accept help." The manipulation was masterful because it contained elements of truth, wrapped in a narrative that cast him as the devoted son protecting his mother from her own poor judgment. Anyone listening who didn't know the full context would naturally sympathize with his position and question my motives for rejecting such reasonable assistance. When Ms. Brennan finished presenting their case, I felt like I was climbing an impossibly steep mountain. They had painted a picture of a confused, isolated woman making irrational decisions that endangered her own welfare, and every piece of evidence they presented supported that interpretation. But then Patricia Henderson stood to present our defense, and I remembered why I had chosen to fight this battle in the first place. She began by calling Dr. Stone to the witness stand, allowing my therapist to explain the difference between grief-induced confusion and actual cognitive impairment. Mrs. Thompson sought therapy voluntarily to help process her grief and navigate complex family dynamics, Dr. Stone testified, her professional demeanor commanding immediate respect. Throughout our sessions, she demonstrated excellent reasoning ability, clear understanding of her circumstances, and thoughtful consideration of available options. Her decisions might not align with her family's preferences, but they reflect careful deliberation rather than impaired judgment. Dr. Stone's testimony was followed by my bankruptcy attorney, who explained how my financial decisions had actually demonstrated sophisticated understanding of my legal options and responsible planning for my future security. The bankruptcy filing that Danny's team had presented as evidence of poor judgment was reframed as a proactive response to circumstances beyond my control. Mrs. Thompson didn't create the debt that threatened her home, the attorney testified. She discovered it after her husband's death and immediately sought professional advice about her options. Her decision to file for bankruptcy protection allowed her to keep her home while establishing manageable payment plans for obligations she hadn't incurred. That's exactly what any competent financial advisor would recommend in her situation. Helen Rodriguez proved to be an unexpectedly powerful witness, describing my engagement with the art class and the friendships I had developed with other women navigating similar life transitions. Her testimony painted a picture of someone actively building new social connections rather than isolating herself from support systems. "Margaret is one of the most thoughtful and engaged students I've ever taught," Helen said, her artist's eye, taking in every detail of the courtroom as she spoke. "She asks insightful questions, helps newer students feel welcome, and approaches every project with careful consideration and genuine enthusiasm. Those aren't the behaviors of someone with impaired cognitive function." But it was Emma's testimony that truly shifted the momentum of the hearing. My granddaughter had asked to speak on my behalf over her father's strong objections, and her appearance on the witness stand created a palpable tension in the courtroom. "I love my father," Emma began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of testifying against his interests. "But I think he's wrong about my grandmother's mental state. I've spent time with her recently, and she's not confused or incompetent. She's just making different choices than my parents want her to make." Emma went on to describe finding Danny's research about senior facilities that dated back to before Robert's death, suggesting that his concern about my welfare was secondary to his desire to avoid ongoing responsibility for an aging parent. Her testimony was devastating because it came from someone with no ulterior motive beyond telling the truth as she understood it. "My grandmother has been taking care of other people her whole life," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "She took care of my grandfather when he was sick, even though it was really hard on her. She's always been there for our family when we needed her. I think she deserves the chance to take care of herself now, even if that means making decisions my parents don't like." The cross-examination was brutal, with Ms. Brennan attempting to characterize Emma as a confused teenager who couldn't understand the complexities of adult financial and healthcare decisions. But Emma held her ground, answering every question with the kind of thoughtful precision that demonstrated exactly where she had inherited her intellectual capabilities. When Patricia Henderson called me to testify on my own behalf, I felt ready to tell my story in my own words for the first time since this legal battle had begun. I spoke about the gradual erosion of my autonomy during Robert's illness, the discovery of hidden debts that had threatened my security, and the family pressure that had tried to manipulate me into accepting solutions that served other people's convenience more than my own welfare. "I'm not asking for the right to make perfect decisions," I told the judge, looking directly at him as I spoke. "I'm asking for the right to make my own decisions, to learn from my mistakes, and to live my life according to my own values and preferences. That's not a privilege that should be taken away just because my choices inconvenience other people." The cross-examination was intense, with Ms. Brennan attempting to portray every decision I had made as evidence of impaired judgment or stubborn pride that overrode practical considerations. But months of therapy with Dr. Stone had prepared me for exactly these kinds of attacks, and I was able to explain my reasoning for each choice without becoming defensive or emotional. "You filed for bankruptcy rather than accepting your son's offer to help you relocate to appropriate senior housing," Ms. Brennan said, her tone suggesting that this decision was obviously irrational. "Doesn't that demonstrate poor judgment about your own best interests?" "It demonstrates different priorities," I replied calmly. "My son's solution would have required me to give up my home, my community connections, and my independence in exchange for his continued financial support. Bankruptcy allowed me to address my debt problems while maintaining my autonomy and staying in an environment where I felt comfortable and supported." The questioning continued for over an hour, covering every aspect of my life and decision-making process since Robert's death. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt like I had been put through an emotional shredder, but I also felt confident that I had represented myself honestly and competently. The judge's decision came after a brief recess that felt like it lasted for hours. When court reconvened, He looked tired but resolute as he addressed both sides of the dispute. This case presents a difficult balance between family concern and individual autonomy, he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many families torn apart by similar conflicts. Mr. Thompson clearly loves his mother and genuinely believes that guardianship would protect her from making decisions that could harm her welfare. But love and good intentions are not sufficient grounds for removing someone's right to self-determination. He went on to review the evidence presented by both sides, acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by Danny's witnesses while noting that concern about someone's choices was different from evidence of actual incompetence. Mrs. Thompson has demonstrated throughout these proceedings that she understands her circumstances, can weigh complex options, and is capable of making reasoned decisions about her own life. The fact that her family disagrees with those decisions, even for understandable reasons, is not grounds for declaring her incompetent. The petition for guardianship was denied, with the judge noting that I had the same right as any other adult to make decisions that others might consider unwise, as long as those decisions were made with full understanding of their consequences. The immediate aftermath of the hearing was a blur of congratulations from my supporters and strained interactions with Danny, who looked like he had been physically struck by the judge's decision. Emma approached me tentatively as we gathered, our belongings, her face reflecting the complex emotions of someone who had been forced to choose sides in a family conflict. "I'm sorry it came to this, Grandma," she said quietly, glancing nervously toward her father. "I hope you know I didn't want to testify against Dad, but I couldn't let them say you were incompetent when I knew that wasn't true." "You did exactly the right thing," I assured her, pulling her into a hug that felt like a lifeline. Standing up for the truth isn't easy, especially when it means disappointing people you love. I'm proud of you for having that kind of courage. Danny approached us as Emma and I were saying goodbye, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes reflecting a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. "I hope you understand that everything I did was because I care about your welfare," he said, his voice formal and distant. "I still think you're making mistakes that will hurt you in the long run, but I accept that you have the right to make those mistakes." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that our relationship had fundamentally changed. The dynamic, where he made decisions and I gratefully accepted them, was permanently broken, replaced by something more complex and uncertain, but ultimately more honest. "I hope someday you'll understand that caring about someone's welfare includes respecting their right to determine what that welfare looks like," I replied. "I never wanted to push you away, Danny. I just wanted the right to live my own life." The conversation was brief and painfully polite, touching on practical matters like holiday arrangements and maintaining contact with the grandchildren while carefully avoiding the emotional damage that had been inflicted during months of conflict. We were family, but we were no longer close, and both of us understood that rebuilding trust would require time and effort that neither of us was ready to commit. The months that followed the guardianship hearing brought a sense of peace and possibility that I hadn't experienced since before Robert's illness. My financial situation stabilized as the bankruptcy payment plan eliminated the crushing uncertainty that had dominated my life for so long. The house maintenance projects that Frank Miller and I had prioritized were completed successfully, proving that I could manage my property responsibly without family oversight. More importantly, I continued building the community of friends and interests that had sustained me through the legal battle. My art skills improved dramatically under Helen's patient instruction, and I even sold my first painting at a local gallery's annual seniors showcase. The modest profit mattered less than the validation that I was capable of learning new skills and contributing something of value to the world around me. Linda's friendship deepened into the kind of genuine companionship I had never experienced during my years of defining myself entirely through family relationships. We traveled together to art festivals and museums, sharing discoveries and perspectives that enriched both our lives. Her practical wisdom and unwavering loyalty had been crucial during my darkest periods, and her celebration of my growing independence felt like a gift I had never expected to receive. Dr. Stone and I concluded our regular sessions with the understanding that I would return if future challenges required professional support, but that I had developed the tools necessary to navigate life's inevitable difficulties without losing myself in the process. The scared, dependent woman who had first walked into her office had been replaced by someone who could face uncertainty with confidence and make decisions based on her own values, rather than other people's expectations. Emma maintained regular contact despite the ongoing tension with her parents, visiting for dinner once a week and calling frequently to share news about her college preparations and social activities. Our relationship had evolved into something more honest and respectful than the traditional grandmother-granddaughter dynamic, built on mutual appreciation rather than obligatory family affection. "I've been thinking about what happened during the hearing," she said during one of our dinners together. "And I realized that watching you fight for your independence taught me something important about not letting other people define who I'm supposed to be or what I'm supposed to want." Her insight delighted me because it suggested that my struggle had served a purpose beyond my own liberation. Emma was learning lessons about autonomy and self-advocacy at 17 that had taken me 67 years to understand, and that knowledge would serve her well as she navigated her own complex relationships and life choices. Lucas remained more distant, clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict, and unsure how to maintain loyalty to both his parents and his grandmother. I respected his position and made it clear that he was welcome in my life without pressure to choose sides or make statements about adult conflicts he shouldn't have to navigate. The first anniversary of Robert's death arrived with less devastation than I had anticipated. I marked the date with a small gathering of the friends who had become my chosen family, sharing memories of the man who had loved me imperfectly, but genuinely, while celebrating the life I had built from the ashes of our shared dreams. Helen brought one of her spectacular casseroles. Linda contributed wine and stories that made everyone laugh, and Martha and Sue from the art class added their own perspectives on loss and renewal. We toasted Robert's memory and my continued independence, acknowledging both the sorrow of his absence and the unexpected opportunities his death had created for my personal growth. "You know what I think Robert would say if he could see you now?" Linda asked as we cleaned up after the others had gone home. "I think he'd be amazed by how strong you turned out to be when you finally had the chance to discover it." Her comment made me consider what Robert might actually think about the woman I had become. The devoted wife who had sublimated her own interests for the sake of family harmony had been replaced by someone more complex and assertive, someone who prioritized her own needs alongside others' expectations. I hoped he would approve of the growth, even if it had required circumstances he wouldn't have chosen. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the trees Robert and I had planted together, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment and possibility. The scared, displaced widow who had stood in this same spot a year earlier, overwhelmed by financial crisis and family pressure, felt like a different person entirely. I thought about Danny's whispered words at Robert's wake, his casual cruelty in assuming I would be easily disposed of once his father was gone. The irony wasn't lost on me that his attempt to get rid of me had actually forced me to discover capabilities and strength I never knew I possessed. His rejection had been the catalyst for my transformation from dependent family member to autonomous individual. The house around me felt different now, not just because Robert was gone, but because it had become truly mine in a way it had never been during our marriage. Every room reflected my own choices and preferences, from the art supplies that had taken over the formal dining room to the garden planning books that covered the coffee table. It was still filled with memories of our shared life, but those memories coexisted comfortably with evidence of my continued growth and change. As spring approached, bringing the familiar cycle of renewal and new growth, I found myself planning projects and adventures that would have seemed impossible during my years of family servitude. Helen and I were organizing a painting workshop for seniors at the community center. Linda and I were researching a summer trip to art museums in major cities. Martha had convinced me to join a book club that focused on memoirs written by women who had reinvented themselves later in life. Most significantly, I had begun volunteering with a local organization that provided support services for women navigating divorce or widowhood. My experience with financial crisis, family manipulation, and legal challenges had given me insights that could help other women avoid some of the pitfalls I had encountered. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying, providing purpose that extended beyond my own needs and interests. "You're becoming quite the advocate," Patricia Henderson observed during one of our periodic check-ins about my financial situation. "I've had 3 women contact me for bankruptcy consultations after speaking with you at the community center. You're developing quite a reputation as someone who helps people understand their options." Her comment surprised me because I hadn't consciously set out to become an advocate or counselor. But I realized that sharing my story and the lessons I had learned was a natural extension of the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. Having survived the attempt to strip away my autonomy, I was uniquely qualified to help other women recognize and resist similar manipulation. The second spring in my transformed life brought unexpected contact from Danny, who called on a Saturday morning in March with a tone that suggested he had been preparing for this conversation for some time. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that happened between us, and I wanted to say that I owe you an apology." The admission caught me completely off guard because Danny had never voluntarily acknowledged making mistakes, much less apologized for the consequences of his actions. "I still think some of your decisions were unwise," he continued, "but I was wrong to try to force you into accepting solutions that served my convenience more than your needs. Emma helped me understand that you weren't being stubborn or incompetent, you were just trying to maintain control over your own life." His apology was far from perfect, still containing hints of his belief that he knew better than I did about my own welfare. But it represented significant progress from the man who had tried to have me declared legally incompetent rather than accept my right to make independent decisions. "I appreciate that, Danny," I said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I never wanted our relationship to become adversarial, but I couldn't accept being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of respect. I know that now. And I was wondering if you might be willing to start over. Maybe have dinner sometime so we can figure out how to be family again without the power struggles." The invitation was tentative and hedged with conditions, but it represented more progress than I had dared hope for during the darkest periods of our conflict. I agreed to meet for dinner at a neutral restaurant, both of us understanding that rebuilding our relationship would require time and genuine commitment to treating each other as equals rather than parent and dependent child. That dinner, when it finally happened 2 weeks later, was awkward and careful but ultimately hopeful. Danny had clearly done some serious self-reflection, possibly with professional help, and was making genuine efforts to understand my perspective rather than simply waiting for his turn to explain why I was wrong. "Emma made me realize something I hadn't considered," he admitted over coffee and dessert. "She pointed out that you raised me to be independent and self-sufficient, to make my own decisions even when other people disagreed with them. But when it came time for you to exercise those same qualities, I tried to prevent you from doing exactly what you had taught me to do." His insight was more perceptive than I had expected, suggesting that our conflict had forced him to examine his own assumptions about family relationships and personal autonomy. The conversation didn't resolve all the damage that had been done during our legal battle, but it created a foundation for building something healthier and more respectful than what we had lost. Jessica remained largely absent from these reconciliation efforts, still apparently uncomfortable with the idea that her mother-in-law had successfully resisted their attempts at control. But Emma continued to serve as a bridge between the generations, maintaining relationships with both sides while refusing to take responsibility for the adults' inability to communicate effectively. "I think Dad is finally starting to understand that respecting your independence doesn't mean he loves you any less," she told me during one of our weekly dinners. And I think you've shown all of us what it looks like to stand up for yourself without becoming bitter or vindictive." Her observation pleased me because it suggested that my struggle had provided positive lessons rather than just family drama and hurt feelings. The scared, submissive woman who had been so easily manipulated had been replaced by someone who could fight for her rights while maintaining her capacity for love and forgiveness. As my second year of independence unfolded, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from what had initially seemed like devastating loss. Robert's death had been genuinely tragic, the end of a partnership that had shaped my entire adult identity. But it had also freed me to discover parts of myself that had been dormant for decades, capabilities and interests that had been suppressed in service of family obligations. The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy my security had ultimately taught me that I was far more resourceful and resilient than I had ever imagined. The family conflicts that had felt like betrayal had forced me to develop boundaries and self-advocacy skills that served me well in all areas of my life. Even Danny's attempt to have me declared incompetent had resulted in legal validation of my autonomy and decision-making capacity. Most importantly, the isolation I had feared more than anything else had been replaced by community and friendship that felt more authentic than many of the relationships I had maintained during my years of defining myself entirely through family. Connections. The women I painted with, the volunteers I worked alongside, the neighbors who had become genuine friends, all knew me as Margaret Thompson, the individual, rather than Mrs. Robert Thompson or Danny's mother. Standing in my garden on a warm evening in late spring, watching the flowers Robert and I had planted together blooming alongside new varieties I had chosen myself, I felt a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with romantic partnership or family approval. I was 69 years old, financially stable, socially connected, and engaged in meaningful work that contributed to other people's well-being. The scared, displaced widow who had once whispered prayers for courage to face, each day had been replaced by a woman who looked forward to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. I had survived my son's attempt to get rid of me and discovered that the life I built from that rejection was richer and more authentic than anything I had experienced during my years of grateful dependence. The phone rang as I was heading. Inside, Linda's voice bright with excitement about a painting exhibition opportunity she had discovered for our art group. As I listened to her enthusiastic description of the gallery space and the application process, I realized that I was no longer surprised by my own willingness to try new things and accept new challenges. "Count me in," I told her, feeling the familiar thrill of possibility that had become a regular part of my life. "I think it's time for Margaret Thompson to show the world what she's been working on." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. My church, my volunteer work, my life in Riverside. Danny and Jessica exchanged a look that I was beginning to recognize, the silent communication of a couple who had discussed their strategy in advance. "Mom," Danny said gently, "what life? You've been so focused on taking care of Dad that you've let all your other relationships slide. When was the last time you went to church regularly or volunteered for anything? You've been isolated for months." His assessment was painfully accurate. Robert's illness had consumed my attention and energy, leaving little room for maintaining friendships or community connections. The women I had once worked with at church functions had gradually stopped calling when I consistently declined their invitations. My world had shrunk to the walls of this house and the demands of caregiving. Besides, Jessica added, Sunset Gardens has transportation services for shopping and medical appointments. You wouldn't need to worry about driving as you get older, and there would always be staff available if you had an emergency. They had anticipated every objection I might raise and prepared responses that made my concerns seem selfish or impractical. When I mentioned wanting to stay close to Emma and Lucas, they reminded me that the children were busy with their own lives and rarely visited anyway. When I talked about the memories embedded in every room of the house, They suggested that holding onto material possessions was preventing me from embracing new experiences. The discussion continued for hours, wearing down my resistance through sheer persistence and overwhelming logic. Every emotional argument I made was countered with practical considerations. Every expression of attachment to my current life was reframed as fear of change or inability to adapt to new circumstances. By the time they left, I had agreed to visit Sunset Gardens the following week and to meet with a real estate agent to discuss listing the house. I hadn't committed to anything definitive, but I felt like I had been maneuvered into a position where resistance was futile and acceptance was inevitable. That evening, I sat alone in the gathering dusk, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated memories and the growing certainty that I was about to lose everything that connected me to the person I had been. The house where I had raised my child, celebrated holidays, grieved losses, and built a life with the man I loved was being reduced to a financial liability that needed to be eliminated. Linda called while I was staring out the kitchen window at the garden Robert and I had planted together, the daffodils we had put in the ground just beginning to push through the soil in defiance of the lingering winter cold. "How did it go with Danny?" she asked, though something in my voice must have already told her the answer. I found myself telling her everything. The financial pressures, the practical arguments, the inexorable logic that seemed to lead inevitably toward displacement and institutionalization. I described Sunset Gardens and the transportation services and the activities calendar that was supposed to compensate for the loss of everything familiar and meaningful in my life. Linda listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding or sympathy. When I finally finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Maggie," she said, her voice careful and measured, "can I ask you something? In all of this planning and organizing and decision-making, did anyone ask what you actually want? Not what makes financial sense or what's practical or what would be convenient for everyone else, but what would make you happy?" The question stopped me cold because I realized that no one had asked, including myself. Every conversation had been framed in terms of necessity and practicality, as if my preferences were irrelevant luxuries that couldn't be accommodated in the face of economic reality. "I don't think I even know what I want anymore," I admitted. "I've spent so many years focusing on what everyone else needed that I'm not sure I have preferences of my own." "Then maybe," Linda said gently, "that's where you need to start. Not with real estate agents and retirement communities, but with figuring out what Margaret Thompson wants from the rest of her life. And maybe, just maybe, fighting for the right to have it." After we hung up, I walked through the house room by room, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just a financial burden or a maintenance nightmare. It was the repository of my entire adult life, the place where I had become a wife, a mother, a woman with her own dreams and disappointments. The idea of reducing it to a line item on a balance sheet felt like another small death, another piece of myself sacrificed to other people's convenience. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt something besides grief and confusion. I felt anger, clean and sharp and energizing. Anger at Danny's casual dismissal of my emotional needs. Anger at Jessica's calculated manipulation disguised as concern. Anger at myself for accepting the role of grateful dependent instead of demanding, to be treated with the respect I had earned through decades of selfless service to this family. That night, I lay awake in the bed I had shared with Robert for over 30 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Somewhere in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, I made a decision that would have shocked the obedient wife and mother I had been for so long. I was not going quietly into the sunset, no matter how lovely the gardens might be. If Danny and Jessica wanted to get rid of me, they were going to have to work much harder than they had anticipated, because Margaret Thompson was about to discover that she had more fight in her than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. My newfound resolve lasted exactly 3 days before reality came crashing down with the force of a wrecking ball. I was organizing Robert's desk drawers when I discovered the folder tucked beneath his appointment calendar, marked Financial Records, Private, in his meticulous handwriting. Inside were documents that shattered every assumption I had made about our financial security and my future options. The medical bills were far worse than Patricia Henderson had indicated. Robert had been hiding the full extent of his treatment costs, paying for experimental therapies and specialist consultations that our insurance had deemed unnecessary. Credit card statements showed charges I had never seen, cash advances that explained the mysterious gaps in our checking account that I had attributed to his declining mental clarity. But it was the loan documents that truly devastated me. Robert had taken out a second mortgage on the house 6 months before his death, borrowing against our equity to pay for treatments that ultimately proved futile. The monthly payments were nearly $3,000, far more than my Social Security and his pension could cover. I had perhaps 4 months before foreclosure proceedings would begin.